In a Hollywood studio, an ambitious young director overlooks a janitor, not knowing he's in the presence of cinema royalty Clint Eastwood. This encounter sets the stage for a transformative journey where dreams are nurtured and the essence of filmmaking is redefined. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and please complete our 1,000 subscribers for more inspiring stories. The bustling office lobby of a major Hollywood studio hummed with energy as executives hurried to their next meetings, clutching scripts and coffee cups. A young, ambitious assistant director named Jake paced nervously by the elevator, rehearsing his pitch to the studio's producers. His goal was simple, yet monumental: secure funding for his first major film. As Jake practiced his lines, a quiet, elderly man in a janitor's uniform ambled into the lobby. He carried a mop and a bucket, his movements unhurried but deliberate. His face, weathered like an old leather saddle, bore the marks of years of hard work. His silver-gray hair peeked out from beneath a faded baseball cap, and his posture suggested a man who had spent decades lifting, bending, and carrying heavy loads. Jake noticed the man as he struggled to clean up a spilled coffee cup that an intern had carelessly knocked over. "Hey, can you do that later? You're blocking the hallway," Jake snapped, barely looking up. The elderly man glanced at Jake, his eyes calm and piercing, then quietly continued mopping the mess. Jake scoffed. "Unbelievable! Can't they hire younger staff for this stuff?" he muttered to himself, unaware that a few people nearby had overheard his remark. As Jake finally boarded the elevator, he couldn't shake the faint feeling that he'd seen the janitor somewhere before. "Nah, just a random old guy," he told himself, brushing off the thought. Meanwhile, the janitor finished his task and leaned on his mop for a moment, observing the hectic scene around him. Though unnoticed by most, he exuded a quiet authority, a kind of unspoken presence that made a few passersby stop and glance his way, though they couldn't quite place why. Upstairs, Jake's pitch was not going as planned. The producers, seated at a long, polished table, looked unimpressed. "It's just another action film," one of them said. "We need originality, something that speaks to people." Frustrated, Jake tried to defend his vision, but his words faltered. He left the room feeling defeated, clutching his rejected script. As he stepped back into the lobby, his eyes landed on the janitor again, now arranging a stack of chairs. "Why am I even trying?" Jake blurted out, more to himself than anyone else. The janitor turned and gave him a long, thoughtful look. "What's the problem, son?" he asked, his voice steady but kind. Jake hesitated, debating whether to unload his frustrations on a stranger, but something about the man's demeanor compelled him to speak. "They don't see the potential in my story. They just want cookie-cutter movies," Jake said bitterly. The janitor nodded slowly. "Maybe your story's fine. Maybe they just don't see you yet." Jake frowned, confused. "What's that supposed to mean?" Before the man could respond, a voice interrupted. "Clint, you're needed on set." Jake's eyes widened as he turned toward the source of the voice. A middle-aged producer was gesturing toward the janitor. No, not the janitor. Clint Eastwood. The realization hit Jake like a freight train. The man he'd dismissed so easily wasn't just anyone. He was one of the most legendary actors and directors in Hollywood. Clint gave Jake a small, knowing smile and tipped his cap. "Good luck with that story, kid," he said before heading toward the studio doors. Jake stood frozen in place, his mind racing. How had he missed it? And more importantly, what had Clint Eastwood meant by his cryptic advice? As Jake watched Clint disappear into the studio, one thing became clear. This was far from over. Jake's head swirled as he left the studio lobby, still reeling from the revelation. Clint Eastwood, the Clint Eastwood, had not only been right in front of him, but had taken the time to offer him advice, and he dismissed him as a janitor. The young filmmaker felt a mix of embarrassment and curiosity. How could someone so iconic blend so seamlessly into the background? What did Clint mean by, "They don't see you yet"? Jake's gut told him there was something deeper to unpack, and he wasn't about to let this encounter fade into a missed opportunity. He decided to stick around the studio, hoping to catch another glimpse of Clint. After an hour of aimless wandering near the sound stages, he found himself standing by a film set. Massive lights illuminated a scene where a group of actors rehearsed a dramatic dialogue, and a familiar figure stood just out of frame, observing with quiet intensity. Clint Eastwood wasn't in the director's chair. He was leaning against a railing, arms crossed, his presence commanding without a word spoken. Jake watched in awe as Clint stepped in to adjust a scene. He didn't bark orders or demand attention. He spoke with the calm authority of someone who knew his craft inside and out. Curiosity got the better of Jake, and he found himself moving closer to the set. He wasn't sure what he'd say, or even if he'd get the chance, but he had to try. Just as the scene wrapped, Clint turned, seemingly aware of Jake's presence without even looking. "You again," Clint said, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Jake hesitated, unsure how to start. I didn't know it was you earlier. I just thought—" He trailed off, feeling foolish. Clint raised an eyebrow. "Thought I was just a janitor?" Jake nodded sheepishly. "Yeah, and I was rude. I'm sorry." Clint waved off the apology with a casual shrug. "No harm done. Happens more often than you'd think." Jake blinked. "Wait, really? People don't recognize you?" Clint chuckled. "Son, when you've lived as long as I have, you learn that fame isn't as shiny as people think. Sometimes it's a blessing to be overlooked. Gives you a chance to see the world as it really is." Jake absorbed the words, struck by how unassuming Clint was despite his legendary status. "But you're Clint Eastwood. You could have people falling over themselves to help you." Clint looked him square in the eye. "That's not what life's about. You don't learn anything if you surround yourself with yes men. The real lessons? They're in the quiet moments, in how people treat you when they think you're nobody." Jake felt a pang of guilt. He'd been so quick to dismiss Clint when he thought he was just a janitor. And now, here he was, getting a masterclass in humility from one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. Clint gestured for Jake to follow him. "Come on, let's talk." They walked through the back lot, passing towering sound stages and prop-filled storage areas. Clint's pace was steady, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jeans. "So, you're trying to make a film?" he asked, breaking the silence. Jake nodded. "Yeah, it's an action film, but with heart. The studio didn't bite." "Studios are like that," Clint said. "They play it safe. But tell me, why does this story matter to you?" Jake hesitated. He hadn't expected the question to cut so deeply. "I guess because it's personal. It's about a father and son who reconnect through impossible odds. It's kind of inspired by my dad. We had a rough patch, but movies were what brought us back together." Clint stopped walking and turned to face Jake. "Then that's your story. Forget the explosions and car chases. Tell the part that makes it yours. Audiences don't care about big budgets. They care about honesty." Jake's throat tightened. He'd been so focused on impressing the studio that he'd lost sight of why he wanted to make the film in the first place. "You think I still have a shot?" Clint smiled, a glimmer of mischief in his eyes. "Kid, I've made a career out of proving people wrong, but you've got to put in the work. Success doesn't come from a handout, it comes from persistence." As they reached the edge of the lot, Clint stopped and leaned against a fence. "I'll tell you what, you rewrite that script. Focus on the heart of the story, then come back and show me." Jake's eyes widened. "You'd look at it." "Only if you're ready to be honest," Clint said. "No shortcuts, no gimmicks, just truth." Jake nodded, his heart pounding with a renewed sense of purpose. He had a lot of work to do, but for the first time in months, he felt like he was on the right track. As Clint walked away, Jake watched him go, his mind racing with possibilities. This wasn't just a chance encounter, it was a turning point, and he wasn't about to waste it. Jake spent the next 2 weeks immersed in his screenplay, tearing apart the original draft and rebuilding it from scratch. Clint's words echoed in his mind. No shortcuts, no gimmicks, just truth. Every scene, every line of dialogue was scrutinized. The father-son relationship that had been a subplot in the original version became the heart of the story. The action sequences were pared down, replaced with moments of raw, emotional connection. Jake poured his soul into the rewrite, drawing from his own experiences and memories with his father. Late one night, as he typed the final words of the script, Jake leaned back in his chair and exhaled. The exhaustion was palpable, but so was the satisfaction. For the first time, the story felt real. It wasn't just another action flick, it was a piece of him. But now came the hard part. He had to show it to Clint Eastwood. 2 days later, Jake stood outside the studio lot clutching a printed copy of his revised script. He'd called Clint's assistant, who'd arranged for him to meet Clint on set during a break in filming. Jake's nerves were frayed. What if Clint hated it? As he was ushered onto the set, Jake spotted Clint standing near a camera, deep in conversation with his crew. He was directing a tense, intimate scene between two actors. Even in the middle of a bustling set, Clint had an air of calm authority. When the scene wrapped, Clint turned and saw Jake. He gave a slight nod and gestured for him to come over. "You got it?" Clint asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Jake handed over the script with trembling hands. "It's different from the first version. I think it's better." Clint took the script and flipped through the pages, skimming the first few. "You stick around," he said, not looking up. "I'll let you know what I think." Hours passed as Clint worked through the day's shoot. Jake sat on the sidelines, watching as the legendary filmmaker brought scenes to life. He couldn't help but be in awe of Clint's ability to balance precision with creativity. Finally, as the sun began to set, Clint walked over to Jake, the script in hand. His expression was unreadable. "You've got something here," Clint said, his voice steady. Jake's heart leapt. "Really?" Clint nodded. "It's raw, honest. You took the risk of stripping it down to the core and it paid off. But," he added, holding up a finger, "it's not perfect. You've still got work to do." Jake nodded eagerly. "I'll do whatever it takes. I just want to make this the best it can be." Clint studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Good, because that's what it takes. I'll make a call to a few people I know. If you're willing to put in the effort, you might just have a shot at getting this made." Jake was stunned. "You'd do that for me?" Clint shrugged. "Kid, I've been in your shoes. Someone believed in me when I was just starting out. It's only right to pay it forward." As Jake left the studio that evening, the weight of his self-doubt began to lift. For the first time, he felt like his dreams weren't just fantasies. They were within reach. Clint Eastwood had seen something in him, and that belief was enough to keep him going. This was more than just a chance to make a movie. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where persistence and authenticity could lead to greatness, and Jake wasn't about to waste it. With Clint Eastwood's support, Jake's screenplay began making the rounds in Hollywood. Clint had called in a favor from a trusted producer, and soon Jake found himself sitting in a sleek office in Los Angeles, pitching his story to a team of industry executives. The room was intimidating. Polished mahogany table, framed posters of blockbuster films, and seasoned professionals who seemed to have seen it all. But Jake stood his ground, recounting the emotional core of his story with the same passion he'd poured into writing it. "It's not just an action movie," Jake explained. "It's about a father and son reconnecting through extraordinary circumstances. The action is there, sure, but it's secondary to the heart of the story." The executives exchanged glances. One of them, a silver-haired man who looked like he'd been in the industry for decades, leaned forward. "We've seen plenty of action scripts, but it feels different, authentic. Clint's name on this certainly helps, but we need to know if you're willing to work with a team of seasoned writers to refine it." Jake hesitated. This was his story, his vision. But Clint's advice rang in his ears. No one succeeds in this business alone. "I'm open to collaboration," Jake said, "as long as the emotional core of the story remains intact." The producer nodded. "Fair enough. We'll be in touch." Weeks turned into months as Jake worked alongside the studio's team of writers. It wasn't easy. There were clashes over scenes, debates about characters, and constant revisions. But through it all, Jake remained steadfast in protecting the soul of his story. Clint checked in periodically, offering guidance and encouragement. "The studio will test you," he warned one evening over the phone. "They'll push you to make it more commercial, more mainstream. Stick to your guns, but know when to compromise. That's the balance." The breakthrough came during a table read, where actors performed the revised script for the first time. The room was filled with laughter, tears, and applause as the story unfolded. Even the studio executives, who had been skeptical at first, seemed moved by the emotional depth of the script. After the reading, the silver-haired producer approached Jake. "We're green-lighting this," he said, extending a hand. "You've got something special here." Jake was speechless. He shook the producer's hand, the reality of the moment sinking in. His dream was finally coming true. A year later, Jake stood on the red carpet, the bright lights of Hollywood shining down on him. The film, titled The Bond, was set to premiere, and the buzz surrounding it was electric. Clint Eastwood arrived just before the screening, his presence commanding as always. He found Jake in the crowd and gave him a rare smile. "You did good, kid." Jake grinned. "Couldn't have done it without you." Inside the theater, as the lights dimmed and the movie began, Jake's heart raced. Watching his story come to life on the big screen was surreal. The audience laughed, cried, and applauded at all the right moments. By the time the credits rolled, the theater erupted into a standing ovation. Clint leaned over to Jake. "That's the sound of a story well told." The success of The Bond marked the start of Jake's career as a filmmaker. But more importantly, it was a testament to the power of perseverance, mentorship, and staying true to one's vision. Years later, when Jake found himself mentoring a young writer, he echoed the same words Clint had once told him: "No shortcuts, no gimmicks, just truth." Thank you for watching till the end video. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, don't hesitate to like the video and share it with your friends too. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell for more fascinating stories.